Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a repeat guest, someone who went to the same high school as me way back in another life. His name is Brandon Dragan. He's an author, a lawyer, and an all-around great human being. So Brandon, welcome back to the show. It's always good to connect.
Yeah, thank you so very much for having me. We had a lot of fun last time, and a lot has happened in my life. A lot has happened in the world since then, so happy to catch up.
Yeah, so with that said, I mean, catch us up. It's been a while since you were on the show. You're now, like I said, you're a lawyer. I think last time you might have been in the middle of or maybe beginning law school, but you were not a lawyer officially yet. So catch us up on what's been going on in the life of Brandon.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. When I first came on, we were talking about my debut novel called The Wages of Grace.
Yep.
And so that released in 2020. And so, yeah, so I think I had just finished my first year of law school.
Hmm.
And yeah, in the years since then, went on to graduate. Fortunately, went on to pass the bar on the first attempt, which is incredible because I don't know that I would have had the capacity to take it again.
Hmm.
It was just, it is everything they say it is.
I hear
And
really
so,
bad stories about it.
yeah, it's just about the most stressful thing I've ever done in my life.
Mm.
And so yeah, so I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary of being licensed to practice law in the state of Tennessee, and I am working in small town where I live outside of Nashville, doing largely criminal defense, but also do some probate law, some general civil stuff, and have really really enjoyed my time.
That's
Every
awesome.
day is still like drinking from a fire hose as far as just what I am trying to learn and trying to absorb every day. But that's kind of the beauty of it. That's why they call it practicing law,
Yeah.
because you are, you're always learning, you're always trying to improve. And I tell people it's absolutely shocking how much law school teaches you in 3 years,
Mm.
but it is also absolutely shocking how much you don't know about practicing law after you've graduated law school and passed the bar. So, but yeah, I'm at a small firm, work with some incredible people, and a couple attorneys who have just been incredibly gracious in kind of shepherding me, bringing me along, and yeah, just enjoying it thoroughly at this point.
That's awesome. Man, I've always like stressed about like the thought of being a lawyer because like you watch all these, these shows like Law and Order and all those kind of shows, but then like I spent time like we knew when I was younger, we knew some lawyers and so who were friends and like I remember going to their offices and stuff like that and they had all these books in there and like you hear them say like in the case of 1945 so and so versus so and so this happened and like I can't imagine like all the cases that have happened in history. And like there's these obviously, I guess these bigger cases that are in these books, but then they go back to these cases. And I can't, my brain just goes on like overload. I can barely remember what I wore yesterday, much less all that information.
Yeah. Well, certainly don't quote me on case citations because that is not my strong point. Yeah, general concepts are my strong point, and that is, I mean, that's another thing. I mean, you will never know more of the law than the day you take the bar exam.
Yeah.
Because it is just once you get into practice, there is such a um, I mean, there's days, sometimes weeks that go by where you're going so fast in so many directions that you may not even look at the law.
Mm,
And so sometimes it's actually because you're just in the practical aspects of it,
yeah.
churning through cases and I mean, what the boundaries are. Like when you get a simple possession case, like there's unless there's a specific issue that comes up, so many times you're just trying to get, what is in the client's best interest. And so it is kind of refreshing,
Mm,
and I'll go back to say, in the 3 years of law school, the law was all I did.
hmm.
That was all I read, that was all I learned about. And so, when you get out and you're meeting with clients on a day-to-day basis, you're, just racing in and out of courtrooms. I mean, there's mornings that I'm in three different counties in one morning, just trying to, trying to make the rounds, so to speak. And so when you get those issues and you get that time and you like carve out an office day to act because you have to write a motion and you're actually sitting down reading the law, sometimes it's just refreshing.
Yeah, right. Sit down, open a book, cup of
A nice
coffee.
change of pace.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the volume of it is just insane. And I mean, I couldn't tell you what the percentages are, but it's there's statutory law.
Hmm.
And then the very big bulk of the law is case law, where judges are interpreting statutes.
Hmm.
And then there's also a tremendous area of law that, and this might kind of be a segue into just what I have learned over time and the way that my worldview has kind of evolved.
Hmm.
There's a huge body of administrative law in the United States that governs our day-to-day activities that most Americans wouldn't even think of when it comes to thinking about the law. I think most people, myself included, before I went to law school, you think about the law, you kind of think of okay, title such and such. You're
Hmm.
reading a statute, but we just live in such a huge country with so many people and so many things going on
Yeah.
that it would be impossible for Congress or any state legislature to just say, these are all the rules, you have to follow all of these. And
Yeah.
so they empower regulatory agencies who have expertise in these areas to promulgate these rules and regulations. And um, every American probably breaks the law every day without knowing it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you throw away the wrong kind of light bulb,
Hmm.
you have broken the law
Yeah.
if you haven't disposed of it properly. And so just when it comes to uh you know those areas, and I mean, I think about, having been raised as an evangelical, like the Lord's Prayer, I always wondered, why do we pray, forgive us our sins,
Yeah.
and, collectively, because like we're all in it together and we're all
Right.
breaking the rules every day, whether we know it or not. So
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's a good segue because I want to talk to you about and ask you a little bit about your, I guess, your evolution and your growth, and we'll obviously get to your books and your new book in particular in a moment. It might even come up in your answer. I'm not sure, but you've obviously done. I think last time you were here, we talked a little bit about deconstruction. We talked about um our roots in our high school. For our listeners, it was a rather conservative evangelical, maybe fundamentalist side of things. And so I'm a little bit curious, like in your study of law and being a lawyer, like practicing law, like how has that at all played into your faith evolution, deconstruction? Because obviously, you're studying law, you're looking at the justice system, it's typically very much about punishment, not so much about restoration. You're dealing with people who, are involved in maybe criminal activities, maybe they're victims of it. And I would have to think that like as someone who grew up in the church, spent time in this evangelical world with this very specific storyline, that we all had, and spend time rethinking your faith, like I'd have to think that, the time in law school maybe has given you a perspective that not everybody has. And so I'm curious about that particular side of things. Like if there's something that has come up for you in your journey that maybe I or our listeners who haven't been on the same path as you, like what are some of those things, if any?
yeah, well, I'll flip it on its head, the question just a little bit, because
Mhm.
I had really been through kind of my deconstruction process largely before I went to law school.
Sure.
So what I'll say is the my spiritual journey actually affected the way that I perceived the law in law school much more than vice versa.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting. Okay.
because, like you mentioned, I mean, I was raised in, not only a conservative religious bubble to a degree, but also a conservative political bubble.
Hmm.
And I think those things to some degree kind of went hand in hand, where yeah, I was always taught, and also like my family, has a law enforcement background. My
Hmm.
dad was a police officer. I have uncles, I have cousins who were police officers, and so I was always taught cops are the good guys. They're here to help you, and we
Yep.
just have all these criminals running around. And anytime you would hear about,
Back to blue, right?
right,
Yep.
right,
Yep.
and that's not to say that to a degree that I still don't,
Sure.
because I still know so many police officers. I
Hmm.
interact with them every day, and I mean, and I can say, the huge majority that I've interacted with are in it for the right reasons.
Yep.
They really care, and frankly, they would take a bullet for you.
Sure.
And so, incredible people in law enforcement. But I guess the issue became when you have to back the blue no matter what,
Hmm.
because the other people are assumed to be criminals. Or you have a situation where, I mean, I just remember thinking so often, like, you hear of a person who was injured or killed by the police after resisting, and the answer was, well, just don't resist. If you didn't
Hmm.
resist, you wouldn't have been hurt.
That's your fault.
And
Yeah.
right, right, and there was so much of that, and even in terms of the law, like, oh, well, this person was selling drugs. That's a crime. They deserve to go away. And if they do it again, maybe we should just put them away forever because they
Hmm.
obviously aren't going to learn their lesson.
Hmm.
And so, what I'll say is, coming from that world, so much of my view on things was black and white. And I feel like what deconstruction tended to do was open me up to nuance,
Uh,
which has
mhm.
just been a game changer for me in every area of my life.
Yep.
Because now, when I look at the law, and when I look at individuals, I don't look at good person, bad person. I look at, what is I mean, there's a legal expression, the totality of the circumstances, like what in total is going on here.
Hmm.
And that was one of the things that was really impactful for me, when I started learning about this concept of restorative justice. And in more conservative circles, this idea kind of gets a bad rap because people think, if we're talking about, okay, like, rather than punitive justice, where we're simply punishing a person, how do
Hmm.
we restore this person to the community? And people tend to think, oh, well, the focus is just on the offender
Hmm.
and not on the victim. And so therefore, we're basically like cheating the victim because we're just giving the offender kind of a second chance or whatever. Well, in the system we have now, we cheat the victim because
Hmm.
they hardly ever really have a voice. So many times, Tennessee is a little bit different, but in so many jurisdictions, the victim doesn't get heard until sentencing.
Hmm.
If somebody assaults you or rapes you, uh, nobody really cares until it comes time that person is convicted and we're sentencing them. Then we want to hear, how harsh do you think the punishment should be?
Hmm.
But nobody is really listening to you. And there are so many examples where, a victim wants to forgive and move on. And it doesn't necessarily mean there shouldn't be any punishment,
Sure.
but the victim doesn't want to see a person go away for a very long time, or something like that.
Hmm.
And there are always nuances in those cases. Another example would be, I just heard this on conservative radio station driving around here in Tennessee, probably last month, about one of the General Sessions Court judges in Nashville, and it was a caller calling in to basically say, this guy is dismissing criminals left and right. He needs to be out of office. Like, we need
Hmm.
somebody that's tough on crime.
Hmm.
And that's another big rallying cry in the conservative circles that I grew up in, this idea of tough on crime. And my experience with that judge in particular is that, again, he is taking the nuance of the situation into account.
Hmm.
It's not that he's saying criminals should skate free. I mean, I watched him hold a hearing where a guy was asking for a bond reduction to take care of his elderly mother,
Hmm.
and the judge was basically like, I feel for you as a human, but looking at your history, I can't trust you to be out on the street right now, and
Hmm.
so, and to me, that was it was a recognition of this person, this accused person,
Hmm.
his humanity, and at the same time taking into account the totality of the circumstance, not just whatever is playing out in front of me right now as a black and white matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you seen the show? On Netflix. It's called Your Honor.
I have started it. Yes.
Yeah, so there, I mean, obviously, it has a whole storyline, but what I love in
Yeah.
the first like episode or two, the judge, who's the guy from Breaking Bad,
Yeah.
um, he he has like this interaction with the people in the courtroom that I thought was just so interesting because again, like for me, coming from my background, politically speaking, and in regards to justice, things like that, is very black and white, just like and you never question authority. You never question police, even like government, like all this stuff was just like they're like it's like almost like they're like divine in a sense. And
Yeah.
now I'm in
Yeah.
this place where like having deconstructed, I see a lot of nuance and I try to see like at the center of all of us, we have the same divine spark. So regardless of me, you, the person who committed the crime in the courtroom, like we all share that spark. And so can we access that humanity? And what I love about that show is like he has this one interaction with this guy where I think the guy stole like $5,000 worth of meat or something like that from a butcher. And he says, they're ready to throw this guy in jail and like that's going to be the end of him. And it could have been a very easy thing, but he said, tell me what happened. And so the guy says, well, I stole the meat. He's like, well, why'd you steal it? Well, because I got out of jail and we were having a birthday party for my son. Tell me about your son. And he went on and on and on and got to the root of the fact that like he stole the stuff, which was wrong, but he stole it because his wife was going to leave him and he was trying to recreate a moment that they had earlier in their marriage when things were great. I had no money, so I stole the meat and it was stupid. But you saw this guy's humanity come through, and it changed the whole like demeanor of the courtroom. It changed the whole demeanor of everything. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And I was wondering, like, does that happen? Like, is that like are there other judges out there that are like that, or is that like a hopeful like a hopeful thing? Or I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there are, but frankly, uh, you hardly ever even get to that point.
Mm,
And I mean, that's another thing about the American judicial system, is just the fact that 90 plus percent of the cases end in plea bargain.
mm,
And I mean that opens up an entirely new door of explanation of exploration when we talk about what is justice.
sure.
Because again, probably the most powerful individuals in the United States are prosecutors,
Mm,
because they decide what you are charged with, and many times, and again, there are, I mean, the vast majority of prosecutors I run up against are reasonable and really good human beings,
mm-hmm,
and they're doing a job just like I'm doing a job. Um, but oftentimes you get charges that are stacked against your defendant where, I've even had charges that I was able to get dismissed as at a preliminary hearing, and then they turn around and hand that to the grand jury who reindicts them on those charges.
mm,
And particularly, when we talk about kind of the conservative way we were raised and everything,
mm-hmm,
nowadays there's this big reaction to this idea of like bail reform or bond reform.
mm-hmm,
This idea that like, oh, we're just letting people back out on the street who have committed crimes.
mm-hmm,
And one of the things that I like to remind people, particularly conservatives, is like these people are um, alleged to have committed crimes, right? Like they're
mm-hmm,
presumed innocent. And so to punish a person before they go to trial it is, in my opinion, unconstitutional.
mm,
And so getting back to the plea bargaining concept, I mean, there are people who plead guilty to crimes that they may or may not have committed simply because they are in jail and they cannot afford to get out.
mm,
I mean, I've had it. I've had a client that that was factually innocent, but could not afford to sit in jail.
mm,
And so that is a whole other concept of what is justice. And again, like you were saying, taking the whole circumstances into account. And again, as a conservative, um, what I never thought about was like, who does that impact? It
Right.
doesn't impact quote unquote criminals.
Yep.
It impacts the poor,
Yep.
and the middle class. If you have, a couple $100,000 sitting in the bank and your bond is $100,000, you can get out for, roughly 10. It's really no sweat off your back. If you are, a single person raising, multiple children, and you're working a job just above minimum wage and struggling to get by, you're going to take whatever deal will see you back on the street as quickly as possible so you
Yep.
don't lose your job, you don't lose your apartment, you don't lose your kids.
Yep.
These are all real world considerations in the justice system that so often get overlooked. And that's also not to say that if somebody um, has demonstrated, that they are a threat to the community at large,
Hmm.
that there shouldn't be a mechanism to, hold that person, for instance, so that they don't do more harm. But it's just this idea of like, well, we shouldn't have bail or we shouldn't have cash bail because we're just letting guilty criminals back on the street. It's like, they're presumed innocent at this stage.
Yeah.
And frankly, as an attorney too, it is much easier for me to have a client come into my office where I can show them the body cam footage. I can ask them questions. We can go through the discovery, and we're not confined to an interview room in a local jail.
Hmm. Yeah. How does that, I mean, this could be a rabbit hole and you don't have to spend too much time. You can go in as much depth as you want, but we talked about before we record that, recently the decision was made in Missouri to, um, the person got the death penalty, but they were, um, and I'm not all up on the case, so I might be using all the wrong terminology, whatever, but that they were presumed they were innocent, and or I should say the facts or the material that was there showed that they didn't do what they were accused of doing. So I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on a situation like that, and like how does, because that always boggles my mind, like how, especially when there is black and white information right here showing that somebody didn't do what they're being accused of doing, like how does it go that far where this decision is made anyway? Like how does it not like how it just like my I don't understand how that works. Like it just like does not compute in my brain if there's information there that shows something different. How do we allow it to get to the point where this happened?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, last night, Missouri executed a man who is largely believed to have not committed the crime
Hmm.
that he was convicted of. And evidence came out after trial that would tend to show his innocence. Um, the the American court system in general, there are basically kind of two underlying principles in terms of the way that our courts run. And the first is efficiency.
Hmm.
We are trying to be as efficient as possible with our time. And the second is finality. Once a court has ruled on something, we don't want there to be thousands of questions and thousands of opportunities to undo every little thing.
Mm,
And so that is another thing that people often don't realize is a criminal conviction is incredibly difficult to overdo
mm,
or to overturn. Once you've been convicted of the crime, in many cases, you not only have to show that your constitutional rights were violated, but you also have to show that the outcome would have been different had your rights not been violated.
mm.
I mean, like that's almost an impossible task. How do
Yeah.
you show, my rights were my rights were violated. I didn't have access to certain evidence. There was a prosecution witness that was tampered with. Many of these things that could have happened,
Yeah.
or even a case where the defendant files a motion to suppress evidence because his Miranda rights were violated.
Mm,
The trial judge denies that motion. um, the jury hears the case with that evidence and convicts you. How can you then argue, well, the jury would have done something else if they didn't hear that evidence?
yeah.
It's an incredibly difficult proposition. And so
Mm,
in the case of Missouri, you even had the trial district attorney. coming out and saying, I no longer believe this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And it didn't matter. And to his credit, I mean, this person's attorneys went up the chain. It went to the governor of Missouri. It went to the United States Supreme Court yesterday, and they declined. They declined to hear it.
Mm.
And again, you know, that's something that's kind of baked into the law is that federal courts are hesitant to overturn state court decisions where there's not some blatant constitutional violation.
Mm.
And so yeah, that's how it happens. And it's brutal. And
So,
I could not imagine being a person's attorney who you firmly believe in their innocence and you do everything possible and you're as powerless as your client is. And obviously they're suffering the ultimate consequence in that case of being executed by the state. But you're also suffering the rest of your life living with, you know, could I have done anything more? Like I just couldn't imagine that scenario.
mm,
And again, that's something that um 15 years ago, I would have had a very different perspective on. 15 years ago, well, he got convicted. If there was really evidence that he was innocent, the courts would have done the right thing and it would have
yep.
been overturned. But now you look at the nuance and you look at how the system actually works, and it's a very different story.
Yeah. It seems like, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like then parts of the system are broken, right? Because I mean, you can have people, like you said, you can have attorneys, even attorneys on the other side who see, yeah, maybe this guy's not as guilty as we thought he was, given this new information. And you can have people on all sides of the spectrum who are ready to fight for this person to, let him go backwards and kind of redo some of this, some of the case and stuff like that. But there's so much red. Once you get to this stage, there's so much red tape to go backwards through. It's like it's an impossible task, and it seems to me like that the system isn't in parts of the system aren't taking into consideration the humanity of the person and the situation they might be in and what could really happen if new evidence comes to light that far down the road.
Yeah, and at that point, I feel like it's a failure of us to consider what actual justice looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, going back to my background, it was kind of this idea of an eye for an eye. You
Yeah.
kill somebody, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And um, at this point, I feel like that's the farthest thing from what actual justice looks like.
Yeah.
There's an attorney that I respect so much. He was actually one of the defense attorneys for Stephen Avery in the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer,
Mm.
Dean Strang, and he just talks about the way that the American system is set up with a presumption of innocence, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and the way that it actually functions so many times. And the fact of the matter is that in the courtroom, one story is told, the other side tells another story, and often the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so as Americans, as Christians, or spiritual people who believe in the concept of justice, where do we err
Hmm.
uh, when we're unsure of what the actual truth is? Do we err on the side of depriving a person their life and liberty, or do we
Hmm.
err on the side of punishment because we suspect that they committed the crime?
Yeah.
I recently came across a defense attorney who has apparently been using this in closing arguments. I think it's pretty gutsy, but I like it. And I've been talking to people where he'll tell the jury, did my client commit this crime? Probably, but probably isn't good enough.
Mm.
It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
And so, I do think like even those standards have shifted a little bit. And
Yeah.
so, but the question is when we don't really know the truth, when we aren't sure about the truth, do we say we're just going to go with the system because it's what we have,
Yep.
or are we going to reevaluate what justice looks like?
Yep. That's right. All right. So all this talk about justice and obviously how your thoughts about it have evolved over time. How does that make its way into your writing? So let's talk about some of your books. In particular, like your new book, and I think the Resurrection of Jesse Barrow, right, was the
Yeah,
name of the previous one. Yeah. So how does like all this thought? I mean, obviously you're thinking about this stuff, you're wrestling with this stuff, you're writing about this stuff. How does it make its way, without giving away any spoilers to the stories? How
sure.
does it make its way into these books?
So my most recent release
Hmm.
before this new one, which this new one, by the way, is called Mr. Bingley, just as a gentleman ought to be. I've got
Love it.
a copy right here. It's actually a Pride and Prejudice variation, which is a big departure for me.
Mm,
But there are some concepts of justice in this one. In this story, if anybody's familiar with Pride and Prejudice, you'll know that Mr. Bingley is kind of the second gentleman to Mr. Darcy.
mm,
And the book is really about Darcy and Elizabeth and their love story, which is one for the ages.
mm,
But my take on it is where Mr. Bingley is something of an avenging angel, where he discovers an evil plot among the British aristocracy, and basically, there's no police force at the time. There's no hierarchy that he can really go to that's not involved in this plot, and so he just starts kind of dealing with things on his own.
mm,
But even in this, in this for him, he is struggling with this concept of, is it just up to me to dispatch justice on my own, or is there another way to do things? And so that comes into play a little bit.
mm,
I will say the Resurrection of Jesse Barrow was very much, it's a novella and then a collection of short stories. It actually includes my one of my law school essays on restorative justice.
mm,
But the novella itself was really about me wrestling with concepts of, not only what we just talked about in terms of when the truth is really unknown, what do we do? But
mm.
also some concepts of, just wrestling with racial justice, and even I think I've maybe it's not unique at this point based on how many Northerners have moved to the South.
Mm,
But I've got a perspective of having grown up in the North, where, for instance, we were the good ones. We won the Civil War. We were on the right side. We got rid of slavery, and
yeah.
we've basically done everything right since.
Mhm,
And then you have on the side of the South this idea of, like, honor and all these things, and so kind of playing on, you know we're all guilty, and we're all dealing with race in maybe a different way. But yes, some of the concepts definitely came through in my writing of that.
mm.
And that one even kind of deals with the death penalty as well, and is that ever an appropriate punishment, when, again, we don't ever really know the facts.
Are there like thinking about, going back to talking about the system being broken and, some of the different things that you bring to light in your writings you've talked about in the conversation. Like, is there, because I don't know, because I don't know a whole lot about this side of things, but like, is there any hope that like these laws will they be changed? Will they be altered in our lifetime? Like, is that because you think about like you said about this case in Missouri and all the red tape you got to go back in order to undo everything that was done. Like, it almost seems like your system is set up in a way where it's almost like impossible to change it. Like, is there ever hope? I mean, I know obviously whoever the president has certain control, things like that, but even in that case, there's still not final authority. There's still like all these different kind of branches they have to go through to make these different decisions. Like, is there any hope of things getting changed down the road and taking more into consideration people's humanity, in your
Yeah,
estimation?
I certainly think so.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we're seeing it all across the country in different ways. I mean, I can say that, in the judicial district where I work, the the district attorney, the prosecutor's office. I mean, I have an incredibly good working relationship with them because they're honest people. They're wanting to see the right thing happen, and I have no doubt that in cases where something we did find new evidence later that the right thing would move towards happening, and you are seeing that in prosecutors' offices all over the country. I mean, some of them are even establishing, where they've known there was a certain, whether it was an evidentiary problem or something like that, where they've known, they're establishing like task forces where people in their own department are looking at old convictions to see like, hey, did we do the right thing here,
Mm,
and making recommendations in cases where it doesn't appear that way. I mean, you also have groups like the Innocence Project, who, when DNA started, you know, really developed into a forensic science,
hmm
where the Innocence Project began with looking at old convictions, and so many of them got overturned because the DNA, which wasn't available at the time the person was convicted, demonstrates that the person wasn't even there and
yeah.
that somebody else
Mm,
was there. And so, you do have people working towards this, but again, that it's something that's difficult for me, having come out of what might even be described as like a Christian nationalist kind of background.
yeah.
The pushback on that, because again, what is so embedded in that world is this idea of, guilt and innocence are black lines, and
Yeah.
once you cross, that's it.
Yeah.
Because that's what we were raised with, and so there is that pushback. I mean, again, it's a pushback against bail reform. It's a pushback against all these things that would make the justice system more humane.
Yeah.
Um, even pushback against, I mean, there's a push to reverse like mandatory sentencing laws and those kinds of things, where we've taken discretion out of a judge's hand when he sentences somebody to look at the circumstances around the crime. We've just taken that out of his hands.
Yeah.
Efforts to undo that. But yeah, there's pushback. Whenever you're trying to make some sort of positive change.
Yeah.
And frankly, some of the changes that we make have unintended consequences, but that's a part of, we've got to keep being alert, and we've got to keep what is justice
Yeah.
in the the framework of what we're doing. Like,
Yeah.
if we're not talking about what is actual justice, then like we've lost the ball completely.
Yeah. I think it's so good to hear that there's, because you're a regular person like myself, like you watch the news, you read the news, you don't hear the stories of the people in the different departments who are doing the kind of work that you just described. So it's like really hopeful, because I was even thinking while you were talking that I had a friend once whose, I think his father was it, or father or his grandfather, somebody was a police officer, and there was a case where they had worked and they put this person away, kind of thing, like for life. And it came up that there were maybe some new evidence, like you said, maybe it was DNA or something like that, they didn't have back in the day when they put this person away, that was coming to light. But there was, I remember hearing there was like this fight, so to speak, within the department, where it was that honor the police, mentality versus the humanity of the person who's in prison. It was like, well, we worked so hard to put this person away. You've got to respect the job that the officers did back in the day, versus the other people are like, well, we can still respect the work that they did, but we also have to respect the fact that there's new science, so to speak, that has entered the picture that has maybe brought to light that this person might not be as, guilty as they were. And there was that internal battle in the police system. But to your point, there were people there in the moment who were fighting for that person, even though they were getting the pushback that they were getting.
Yeah, no, and that goes back to, I mean, I think there are so many good people doing such good work,
Yeah.
and even, even in cases where, like you said, where there is some resistance
hmm
on the side of the officers, I mean, so often I don't think that's based in, uh in bad motivation, right? I mean, they
Right.
firmly believe we got the right guy.
Sure.
And usually, I mean, usually it's perceived as like some guy like me, oh, now you're trying to overturn this. Oh, now you're
Yeah.
trying to, on a technicality, get him out or whatever.
Yeah.
And so again, like I understand the elements of that.
Yeah.
And there should be a rigorous process where the courts actually look at what's going on, and if a deep dive is necessary into, okay, what happened then, what do we have now, what does this look like,
Yeah.
I think that should happen. But
Yeah.
the fact is too, like we talked about efficiency earlier in the court system,
hmm
trials are expensive,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
you call jurors out from their jobs, and
Yeah.
and frankly, I mean, I've got a trial starting next month that we've been preparing for 2+ years.
Wow.
And so, this idea that, okay, you have this trial and then, maybe a year from now it gets overturned and you got to go do it all over again. That's daunting.
Yeah. It's like all that work that you put in. Like, what was it good for?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that is part of the resistance. And again, like I said, so many times it's just that, when you see something from a police perspective, like, or even from the prosecutor's perspective, like they really believe they've got the right person.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that's what it's founded in. But again, I think that we could do better to have some processes in place where we're actually going to talk about where we're at now,
Yeah.
as opposed to this guy was convicted, so what do we do?
That's right. That's right. So good. Brandon, we're just about out of time. I wanted to ask you about First Amendment, all the different things, but we just didn't get to it. So we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, yeah, no, that would be fun. That's definitely an area of interest for me, and particularly on the religious side of the First Amendment. Just what you're seeing now. Yeah, I forget who it was, maybe Texas or somebody that just put the Ten Commandments back in all the schoolrooms, and
Yep.
I mean that's something that's right up my alley. So would love to come back and discuss that further. But this was a great conversation. Again, thank you so much for having me back.
Absolutely. And real quick, where can people go to connect with you, any of your work online? You want to direct us anywhere?
Yeah, so my website is brandondragan.com. That's Dragan. And then you can also find me on Facebook at Brandon Dragan Author. And then my books are all on Amazon.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes and we'll do it again.
Awesome. Thanks
All
so
right.
much. Take care.